Well, Jeff Goodell has covered climate change for more than 2 decades at Rolling Stone, and he is the author of several books, including his most recent, The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. Jeff Goodell, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Hi, happy to be here.
Well, it's so great to have you on. Been a fan of yours for years, and this book is absolutely exceptional. This is an incredibly compelling read, and on such a critical topic. You know, you've obviously written books on coal and geoengineering and sea level rise. As I mentioned, you've been writing magazine articles for decades now on myriad climate topics. I'm curious how you determine when and how you want to write a book about climate change.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. It's very intuitive. I mean, it's partly, having covered climate change for a long time, I have a sense of sort of the rhythm of the sort of larger narrative that we're all communicating about climate and things, aspects of the story, the larger story that are told and untold, is part of it. Part of it is sort of like, choosing to get married or something. It's like, do I want to spend 3 or 4 years with this idea? Does it have the kind of complexity and the depth to hold my interest for that amount of time? But it's also, it's a very scary process because you commit yourself to a book for several years and it comes out, and the world that you write it in is sometimes very different from the world that it emerges into. In this case, the world that this book emerged into was sort of eerily like the world that I was writing about, but it doesn't always work out that way.
Yeah, it's wild as we've seen this summer of 2023 unfold, how extreme heat as that is like at the center of the news cycle. Like, what have you made as you've watched these events unfold over the last couple of months?
Well, I mean, it's surprising and not surprising, right? So, the reason I decided to write a book about heat was because I realized that after 10 years of writing about climate change, or even more at that time, I still, even though I thought about heat all the time, and it was like, global warming, obviously heat was an issue, I never really thought about it in any kind of personal way. And I took this walk in Phoenix on a really hot day 4 years ago, and I got all dizzy and felt my heart pounding, and realized that this was the heat and it was dangerous. And if I had to walk another 12 blocks, I don't know what would have happened. And I thought, I know nothing about how this works, why this is impacting me this way. And it really struck me how ignorant I was about heat and about the consequences of heat in a personal way. And that's sort of what launched me on the book, and to try to talk about this, this experience of heat in a very direct, personal way, what it does kind of to our bodies. But, I also understood that, this was a subject that was only going to, pun intended here, get hotter over time, right? I mean, it was not a complicated, insight to see that, if heat's an issue now, it's going to be even more of an issue in 3 or 4 years when the book comes out. So that was straightforward. But, to have the book emerge exactly at the same time when we have these, I'm in Austin, Texas, this heat dome here that has had broken records, these records in Phoenix, China, Italy, all over the world, is a little eerie. It's a little like, I feel like I'm kind of in my own Stephen King novel, in a way, but it's been great in the sense that simply as an opportunity to talk about this stuff, not, I think these windows of communication open at moments like this, and people will listen and hear, and are sort of open-minded at these kinds of moments. And so I feel very privileged to be able to talk to people about my book and about the risks of heat and of climate change more broadly.
One of the things you write, I'll read a passage here from near the beginning of the book, quote, "It is not how anyone expects to die. In part, it's because we live in a technologically advanced world where it's all too easy to believe that the rough forces of nature have been tamed. But it's also because our world is changing so fast that we can't grasp the scale and urgency of the dangers we face," unquote. What is it that you're hoping people will actually grasp by reading this book?
Well, I gave this book the title "The Heat Will Kill You First," and it was very controversial among my friends and people that I trust about things like this. And giving a name to a book is a big deal. And people thought, oh, no one's ever going to read a book like with that kind of title. It's too scary. That's just a terrible title. And others thought, oh, it is a good title. And this goes to your question, which is I really wanted this book to feel immediate and now, and about our lives right now and the risks that we face, you and me and everyone we know, as a result of these sort of extreme heat waves. So, what I really want people to get in this book is that, these extreme events, this climate change and all that is not happening in some faraway place, that we have plenty of time to decarbonize our energy system and we'll adjust to this and we'll just sort of gradually adapt. And we're sorry that some people will suffer and die, but really we'll be fine. And, this is just this sort of long, slow transition that we're undergoing. And we humans are really smart and we'll deal with this and everything's cool. And I wanted to really make the case that this heat is an emblematic of how climate change is happening right now, is happening fast, and your life is at risk as a result.
One of the things that I think is great about this book and often just gets missed is how deadly extreme heat is. Sorry, this is the extreme weather event that causes the most death. When you try to get across the idea of just what a problem extreme heat is around the world, like how big is the scale of this problem?
Well, I mean, it's huge, right? I mean, we're seeing that in real time. And one of the interesting things with this book coming out at the time of these extreme heat waves all around the world is that it's becoming very clear to people what a risk heat is. I mean, they don't have to read my book to see that. They go outside and go for a walk in the middle of the day, and they realize that, this is scary, and I feel funny, and how much can I deal with, and how much can I handle? And so these extreme heat domes and these extreme temperatures are kind of doing the job of making people pay attention to what a big problem this is. It's the enormity of heat risk is really difficult to communicate easily, right? I mean, all living things on this planet, us, lizards, elephants, butterflies, redwood trees, the weeds in the backyard, all evolved in this certain temperature range. And we're all, more or less adapted to a certain range of temperatures. And the big argument that I make in my book is that I call it, the Goldilocks Zone, which is a phrase that scientists use who are looking for life on other planets, for the sort of not too hot, not too cold, where there's liquid water present. And, the big threat is that we are, slowly but surely moving out of this Goldilocks zone. And, which means we are moving out of the range of temperatures that we and all other living things have evolved to live in. And that is very dangerous and very scary in the biggest sense for life as we know it on this planet.
It's one thing to cite the facts and figures, which is, obviously incredibly necessary. You do a great job of doing that in the book, but you also tell incredibly compelling, meaningful stories in this book. And as listeners might imagine, if they've not read the book already, this includes telling tragic stories, people who have died in extreme heat. You write about a family in California that dies tragically when they go out for a hike, and they eventually encounter extreme heat. You write about a man in the Pacific Northwest who dies tragically working out in the heat as part of his job. I can imagine that telling these stories is the hardest thing to write about, but I found reading it and your retelling of the stories, it grounded me in the reality of the tragedy of extreme heat, and it made these statistics and facts feel like more real and not just like numbers. And it makes it honestly more horrific and more urgent and more meaningful. And I just thought you handled these stories with a lot of care and compassion and humanity. And like, let's be honest, like many retellings of tragedies can feel at times like exploitative and gross and unnecessary. And reading this book, I was like, Jeff is going to save people's lives by writing about this in this way. And I'm being serious. And like, and I, as a journalist, like I know you have decades of experience, like honing your craft. And I know you started out as a crime reporter and covering the HIV and AIDS pandemic in New York at its height in the 90s. But just because you have the skill set doesn't make it easy. I'm curious, like, what is your responsibility? What's the responsibility you feel when you're retelling the story of someone else's tragedy to your readers?
Well, that's a great question. And that's something that I feel very deeply and is really important to me. You know, I think it's really important to tell these human stories, to communicate the here and now and the reality of these kinds of, things we're talking about, and to make, extreme heat and climate change something that is happening to us and that we are feeling. And one way of doing that is telling the stories of people who have suffered, and in this case died, as a result of heat. But telling the stories is, it's very hard. In both cases, I got the blessings of people who were close to the family. And in the first case of the family who went for a hike in California and died on the trail, I got the blessing of the brother of Jonathan Garish, who was very generous and kind to me, and was at first a little skeptical and, obviously felt a sense of privacy about this tragedy that he and his family had to suffer through. The loss of his brother's wife, their child and their dog. I mean, all of that, very private, personal grief that they felt. But, after talking to him for a while, he came to trust me. He looked at some of my other work, understood that, it was not going to be, I was not going to write about this in an exploitive, cheap thrills kind of way. And so when you have the confidence and the trust of someone close to the family, and that helps a lot to kind of liberate you as a writer to do this, because that you're working with the blessing of the family, and that these stories I'm telling these stories and trying to make them as moving as possible in order to communicate something. You said this will save lives, and, I hope that's true. And that's sort of the way I think about it. I want to tell these stories because I want people to feel the grief and the power and the pain and the suffering that these people went through, so that they pay attention, and that, when their son or daughter or father or mother or whoever, goes out for a hike on a hot day, they think differently about what they're doing. So it's sort of journalism and writing with a kind of higher idea in mind. And then it's just, being careful about how you say things, about making sure the facts are all correct. I take all that very seriously. It's hard. It's very emotionally difficult as a writer to do also.
Yeah, and again, you did it so incredibly well. But in reading that, I'm like, oh, this could happen to anyone. I work in climate every day and think about this all the time. That absolutely can happen to me, right? And I think you write about your own hiking experiences in really interesting detail, and it just shows you how scary and dangerous, and again, how like we have not tamed nature. This is something that could happen to anyone. So I was really glad that you wrote about it in that way. If for people who are trying to understand the way extreme heat can impact them, like what is happening to our bodies when we are immersed in extreme heat?
Well, what's happening to our bodies is that our bodies are trying desperately to cool off, right? So, we have evolved to maintain a steady body temperature of about 98.6, 99 degrees Fahrenheit, which, varies a little bit during the day and in different conditions. But basically, our body is very good at keeping that stable temperature. And we all know that whenever you go to the doctor, the first thing they do is take your temperature and ask if you have a temperature. So body temperature, internal body temperature is just really vital to life for warm-blooded animals like us. And so what happens when we get into heat and we get into extreme heat conditions and any kind of exterior conditions that is heating up our body, is that our body starts working hard to cool off. And we have one mechanism for cooling off, which is a very efficient mechanism, and a mechanism that other animals don't have, at least to the degree that we do, is sweat. So our body cools off by squirting water essentially onto our skin. That water then evaporates and carries the heat off with it, and it cools the blood beneath our skin. So as our bodies start to heat up on a hot day, or because we're on a hike, or whatever the conditions are, you're sitting in a really hot car, or whatever the conditions are, your heart starts pumping faster because it's starting to pump the blood towards your skin, and the blood, as it kind of travels beneath the skin, it cools off and recirculates and cools down your body. And that works fine to a point. But when you get to the point when you can't cool, your body can't cool off fast enough, your heart starts pounding faster and faster. It starts putting more blood out towards your skin surfaces. Your circulatory system gets under more pressure, veins start dilating. And one of the reasons you get lightheaded, for example, during extreme heat exertion is because the blood is literally being pulled out of your brain towards the surface of your skin to cool off, and you lose blood pressure in your brain. And the same thing happens with other internal organs. And so if you don't cool off, your heart is under extreme stress right there. And many people, that's why a lot of vulnerable people, older people who have heart conditions or any kind of circulatory problems, they will sometimes die, right then, because their heart is under such stress. And but if you have a strong heart and you're still sort of functioning, your body temperature continues to rise, and you get more and more consequences, nausea, all kinds of things. But at a certain point, and it's not that high, 104, 105 degrees body temperature, the membranes of your cells actually begin to melt or denature. And the proteins which control the cellular functions in your body, which are folded in different kinds of ways to define their functions, begin to unfold. And your body starts hemorrhaging internally because the sort of cells are falling apart. And just to be really blunt, you kind of melt from the inside. And it's a pretty horrific way to go.
And reading the book, I found this really interesting. Like, you can be hydrated, you can be drinking water, but if you're out in exposed heat, like, you can still die. Like, there's almost so much, like, and you can explain this better than I can. Almost only so much you can sweat, only so much your body can just cool you down, that if you're out in exposed heat with no shade, no way of cooling your body, like, it doesn't matter how much water you drink.
Right. There's a lot. That's one of the big misconceptions people have, is they think that drinking water cools you off in some way, that just the act of drinking water is somehow, like when you pour water on a hot pan, it cools off. And that's what happens in our bodies, but it's not. Our bodies cool off by sweating, and water is really important because you need water to sweat. But sometimes, as you pointed out, sweating is not sufficient. And even if you have plenty of water, and there's been a lot of research on this, for example, with wildfire fighters who are working in hot conditions with heavy equipment. They have a lot of water with them, and they still get heat strokes because they're in such intense heat, and it doesn't matter how much they sweat, they cannot cool off because their body's temperature is rising faster and faster. So drinking water is important, but it is not sufficient. It is not going to save you in extreme conditions.
And you mentioned this, like, the most vulnerable populations are the most susceptible to things like heat stroke, but even being young and in great shape will not save you, right? There's countless athletes who have been killed by heat stroke because it's weird to even read this in the book. Like, sometimes being in great shape can kind of trick your body into not showing you the signs of heat stroke, right?
Totally. And also tricks your mind into thinking that you're tough enough to handle this, right? I mean, there's a lot of stories of marathoners, runners. I talk about one runner, who ultra marathoners who go out on these runs in these extreme conditions and think because they're ultra marathoners and their hearts are strong and they're in great shape that they're not vulnerable to this, and they are. They are as vulnerable to this as anyone. And heat is a universal killer. I mean, there are different levels of vulnerability, right? Someone who's 85 years old and has a weak heart is far more vulnerable than an ultra marathoner. But if an ultra marathoner goes out and stresses his body in extreme heat in extreme ways, he or she is going to die just as easily as the 85-year-old person with a weak heart sitting in a hot apartment.
Okay, I have to ask you a very dumb question that I was thinking about it reading the book and thinking about when you were giving this answer. You mentioned how heat, sweat evaporates off your skin, which helps cool you down. And like a humid heat is more dangerous than a dry heat. So like literally, why is that true? Why is it that, because in a humid heat, right, the sweat won't as easily evaporate off your skin. But why does that actually cool you down?
Why does sweat cool you down?
No, how does because it's the evaporation of sweat, right? That sort of like cools you down. Like what is happening to your body in a more humid heat that makes it more dangerous?
What happens in a humid heat is that there's more, when the air is humid, there's more water vapor in the air. That's why it's humid, right? The percentage of water vapor in the air is much higher. And air can only take so much water before it literally starts kind of raining out, right? That's what rain is. It's just the, water vapor in the air becomes so much that it falls out of the sky, right? And so when the conditions are humid, the air just will not take up any more water. And so, or will take it up much more slowly. If you're in a dry conditions, then the air is eager to absorb that water. And so if you're in the Mojave Desert and it's 125 degrees, sweat will dry very quickly, and your body will be far more efficient in cooling it off than if you're even in 110 degrees in Miami on a really, really brutally humid day, because the sweat is not evaporating because the air is already so full of water. And that's that feeling you have of sitting in a kind of pool of sweat. And that's why wet heat is much more dangerous, because this cooling mechanism, which depends upon the evaporation of water to carry the heat away, basically, is not functioning. And it doesn't mean the dry heat is not dangerous. It just means that for equal kind of temperatures, wet heat is much more dangerous than dry heat.
Living in cities can be a particular danger, right? As global temperatures are rising, cities are there's heat problems that are being exacerbated everywhere. But in cities, like the rising of temperatures is even happening faster than global warming, right? And only being exacerbated by global warming. You're right that, quote, cities everywhere have to adapt to rising heat. It is the great urban engineering project of our time, making the city that was not designed for extreme heat into a city that is livable during an extreme heat, unquote. Why are cities so vulnerable to heat?
Well, it's pretty simple, because they're built of materials that absorb and radiate the heat back. I mean, it's no accident that, the incident that I described in Phoenix, that was the sort of genesis of this book, happened, as I was walking downtown in a landscape that was completely concrete and asphalt and glass. And, temperatures in a place like that, the air temperature that day when I was walking was, I think, 115 degrees, but it was probably 140 degrees where I was actually walking, because the way that the asphalt and the concrete absorb and then radiates back the heat. So cities are, they have this term called urban heat island effect, and it's universally true that cities, some are hotter than others, but because they're built with these materials that absorb and radiate heat back, and are built generally with no thought of heat and dealing with heat and the effects of heat, that they're the most dangerous places to be, especially if you're living on the streets, or living in a house or apartment without air conditioning, working outside. All of these kinds of things make cities real death traps when it comes to extreme heat.
And it's far just from, really hot places like in Phoenix, and you cover a city in India as well. Like I thought it was really interesting that you write about Paris. And of course, in the early 2000s, they had that extremely deadly heat wave that went through Paris as well. And in Paris, they have these zinc roofs that you write about, which are partially, kind of what many view to be part of the character of the city. And these are some historic buildings. And I thought it was really interesting how you write about this tension between preserving the past, right, with these zinc roofs, or adapting to the present and the future. And there's a lot of tension between people of, retrofitting these buildings to make them cool. Most of these buildings, right, and in Paris and other places in Europe, they don't have air conditioning. Like, it's not ready for the world that we're living in. How do you see us having to make really complicated, complex decisions on how we change our cities and how we make buildings more adaptable to the actual world we're living in now?
Yeah, I mean, the Paris example is a really fascinating example because of the sort of paradox of, the very thing that many people think of as defining Paris, which are these zinc roofs, which are very beautiful. Anyone who's ever been to Paris would recognize them in a second. And that were built, in the 18th and 19th century and define Paris in a certain way, also now define the vulnerability of Paris and are exactly the kind of wrong things for a world that like Paris, that is extremely vulnerable to heat. And this tension about what to do about them, and it also, extends to the idea of air conditioning. Like, as you said, there's not many buildings in Paris that are air conditioned. And the idea of, like a lot of Americans do, they just hang an air conditioner out their window, right, and plug it in. And, and people in Paris, that's not allowed, because of in the inner city, because of the historic preservation and all that, and the idea of not ruining the sort of visual splendor of the city. It becomes a really complicated fight. And it's the same thing with, they're trying to redo the Champs-Élysées, one of the main big boulevards there, take away some of the traffic, make it greener, less of a sort of heat, less of a frying pan. And there's a lot of people who don't want change. So it's a really hard issue. And it's easy to say, oh, we should just plant more trees in downtown and more green spaces, in urban areas, which is absolutely true. We should have more shade, more trees, more green spaces. But actually doing it is really complicated. And it's going to take a long time. I mean, Paris, Austin, any city, it's evolved over hundreds of years, right? And so the notion that we're just going to fix this in the next couple of years, with some sort of well-meaning urban planning, is just incredibly naive. So we have to get started. We have to think seriously about this, but we also have to realize that there's no sort of quick fix to this urban heat island problem.
And there are literal limits to adaptation in an urban setting. And what is really scary is some of the conversations that you had with urban experts about what a heat catastrophe could look like in the city. Like, what did you find the scariest about your research into what experts are worried about could happen in a place like Phoenix?
Well, one of the infrastructure experts I talked to in Phoenix described what he called a heat Katrina, referring to Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans a decade or so ago. And in his description, heat Katrina would be essentially a blackout, a 12, 24, 36-hour blackout in a city like Phoenix on one of these extreme heat days when the temperatures are 115, 120 degrees. During these kinds of days, like people are having in Phoenix right now, and we're having in Austin right now, the grid is strained to its maximum capacity, and because everybody's turning up their air conditioning, right? And so the grid is under tremendous pressure at these moments. And ironically, and kind of tragically ironically, it's the thermal generation plants, i.e. natural gas, that are most vulnerable during these kinds of events, because the heat increases the probability of malfunction in these plants. They're mechanical, and the heat stresses the metal and makes the connections and the mechanism of these thermal plants much more vulnerable. Solar and wind do much better in these heat conditions. But nevertheless, the idea is that there will be inevitably, he said, and I agree with him, a major blackout in a really hot city during an extreme heat event. And the problem with that is that the way we build buildings now is that we build them sealed up for air conditioning, with the assumption that air conditioning is always going to work. The way we built buildings 100 years ago, there was natural ventilation systems, there was transoms that opened, there was dog trot passages between parts of the building to let breezes through. They were not built with the idea that they're only sustainable if you have this mechanical system going. But now, as you know, and I mean, it drives me crazy. I go to hotels and you can't open the windows, right? And you have a choice of having this clanking air conditioner blowing in your office or hotel room, or nothing, or you're in a sealed room. And in the case of a blackout during an extreme heat event, these buildings become convection ovens, and they become very quickly death traps. And this guy predicted, deaths of thousands of people during an event like this. And I think he's absolutely right.
And that's a critical point, right? Because, and I know you discuss this in the book, people will say, well, if in Minneapolis they can live in extreme cold, why can't Americans living in really hot cities just like adapt to a summer and extreme heat? And of course, obviously there are many examples of extreme cold disasters, and certainly in Texas is no stranger to that, having lived through that in the winter of 2021. But extreme heat really does present some unique struggles, especially in areas where they think maybe they've experienced extreme heat, but like what we are living through now truly is unprecedented, right?
Right. And, so yes, it's true. I mean, obviously we can survive on all kinds of extreme conditions, right? I mean, we went to the moon. I mean, we go to the bottom of the trench in the center of the Pacific Ocean, right? I mean, humans are incredibly adaptable if they have the right technology, if you have the right experience and plenty of money. So you can imagine, Phoenix rebuilding itself, becoming an underground city, all kinds of renovations that make Phoenix much more habitable in extreme heat. But the problem is that it takes a lot of money and a lot of time. And, a city like Minneapolis was built from the cold from the beginning. I mean, it was always a cold place. They built it with, speaking of underground, a lot of underground stuff, buildings insulated. The idea of cold was not a kind of new idea for anyone living in Minneapolis. And what's happening in places like Phoenix is that we're seeing these extreme heat events that are much longer, much hotter, and are approaching the limits of what a human can handle without being sheltered in an air-conditioned building or something like that. So we're literally pushing the boundaries of habitability very rapidly. The change is happening very rapidly. So yes, we could, Phoenix can rebuild itself, and you can imagine what a thriving city would look like in Phoenix with 130-degree temperatures. It's certainly possible, but it's like, at what cost and for who? And that is not the Phoenix that everybody has moved there for. People have moved there because taxes are low, real estate is cheap. People like the idea of hanging out in their flip-flops all year long. It's a very different than, oh, fuck, this is a death trap if I'm not in an air-conditioned space for the next 3 months.
And like to underline that point, more Americans are moving closer to the heat, which you write about in the book. What problems can that pose?
Well, lots of problems. I mean, first of all, I'm an example of someone who moved into the heat. I lived in upstate New York. I lived in New York City for a while, and then I lived in upstate New York. And 4 years ago, I moved to Austin, which from a climate point of view makes no sense whatsoever. I was in a very kind of, no place is a perfect refuge, but it was a very, kind of cool, lots of water, very kind of hospitable climate. And I moved to the kind of belly of the climate beast here. But I did it because I fell in love with a woman who lived here, and I wanted to be with her, and we got married. And that was more important to me because she had a job here and we couldn't move anywhere else. So the reasons people are moving to these hot places is very complex, right? There's jobs, there's cheaper real estate. People, as I said, people generally like warm weather. They would prefer to be in a place where they can wear shorts all the time than they would be in a place where they have to wear, 2 layers of down jackets all the time. But the problem is that this sort of happy southern warm temperature nirvana idea is rapidly changing, and it's no longer. It's one thing to wander around Austin here when it's 95 or 90 degrees and it feels warm and kind of nice, and then it's very different to be wandering around Austin when, like, yesterday was 109, and you live like a vampire. You don't go outside during the day. You go out at night. You get up at 5 a.m. to take a walk or go for a run. Outdoor patios are all closed during the day. You go to the library. We have a fabulous library here. It's jammed with people, which is fabulous. But people are, basically burying themselves inside during the day. And it's a very different rhythm. And summer feels like a dangerous time of year. Everybody here in Austin can't wait for summer to be over because it's too scary. You can't go for hikes, any of this kind of stuff. And it changes your life in a big way.
And we've been talking about this a lot on the podcast. I'm here in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we've had a lot of wildfire smoke from Canada this summer, and at times being like on the rankings of the most polluted cities in the world, and that sucks and it's bad. But like I have the privilege, I can just stay inside, right? I can work inside when it's really hot. They can be air conditioned, and like that's just not true of people who have to work outside. Right. And this is one of the things that is the scariest about extreme heat is how this is going to impact labor. And I was astonished to learn that there's just really nothing with regards to OSHA and like labor restrictions that like really factor in heat. Like what is happening on the federal level when it comes to protecting our workers who work outside?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's a complete outrage. Department of Labor, OSHA, has been working on heat standards for 7 or 8 years, and they can't manage to come up with anything and pass any laws protecting workers from extreme heat. Simple things like requiring, water and shade breaks, temperature limits for what people are allowed to work outside. We have all kinds of labor protections on other issues, but for some reason, there's a complete failure on the federal level to deal with this. And I think it's partly because, largely because a lot of companies have been fighting these regulations, arguing that it will hurt their productivity, right? Like the idea that people don't die and are allowed to take a 15-minute, shade and water break every hour or 2 hours when the temperatures are extreme is somehow like, some kind of communist anti-capitalist idea that you should have these sort of humane water breaks. Some states are stepping up. California and Oregon have both, and Washington have both passed recently, partly as a result of the death of a farm worker during the 2021 heat wave that I wrote about in my book that we got a lot of attention. And so states are moving in that direction. So that's good. But here in Texas, the governor Greg Abbott, 2 weeks ago, on one of the hottest days of this like 2 or 3 week, extremely hot season we've had here, signed legislation prohibiting any city or county in Texas from passing any laws requiring shade and water breaks for outdoor workers, which is just like barbaric and insane, and evidence that we're not going to, in a sort of general and kind of good government way, be able to deal with this, right? That we do need something like a federal standard that would eliminate the ability of people like, Governor Abbott, who he guised it in this productivity idea that, we can't afford this. It's too expensive. Texas is a boom town. And, there's this sort of Texas macho with heat, like, real cowboys, aren't afraid of heat kind of thing. And then there's also an element of racism in it, right? That a lot of the outdoor workers in Texas who keep the state going and do all the hard work are Mexicans, coming across the border legally or illegally, and they're amazing and do all the hard work, but they're not exactly the people that our governor really cares about protecting.
What do you worry about most when in the research you've done around the exposure that workers have to extreme heat and how this can impact labor now?
Well, I think what I worry about most is the same thing I worry about in the broader sense of how we're going to adapt to extreme heat more broadly and to climate impacts more broadly, which is simply that we will adapt by getting used to it. We will just accept that, we're sorry, but the 200 workers died this summer in Texas, or 300 workers or 500 workers or whatever it is. But, it's a hot place, and, they should have drank more water, and, it's too bad, but we're moving on. And I fear that very broadly with climate in general, that we will just begin to think that these extreme events, whether they're heat or drought or, bigger storms, bigger wildfires, whatever thing you want to choose, is just the sort of way it is. And these losses are part of our world now, similar to the way we have adapted to some of the losses with COVID, right? And just like, okay, well, we're going to X thousand people a year are going to die of this, and there's not much we can do about it. In fact, we have this anti-vax movement that is explicitly like, arguing against this very clear scientific evidence that vaccines work and save lives. And we have an entire party in America that is, undermining that and just saying, people die, that's too bad. I want to be able to go outside whenever I want and not have anybody tell me to wear a mask or have to get any kind of vaccine. So that's what I am most worried about.
And it's like the cascading effects of heat. It's just so widespread, and you write about the potential threats that we could face to our food systems as temperatures rise across the globe. What problems might we face in the future as global temperatures are rising to things like crop production?
Well, that's a huge issue. I wrote about it in the book. I went to the Rio Grande Valley in Texas here, which is one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the country. And, food crops, just like every other living thing, have thermal limits. They're just like us. They can handle certain temperature ranges, and then things get too hot and they die. And that's a, simple law of all life on this planet, and food crops are no different. So what we're already beginning to see is, food crops that are really important to us, like wheat and like corn, beginning to hit the edges of their thermal limits where they're grown. Iowa is coming very close to, the really important place, obviously, for corn in America is coming close to the limits of heat that they can handle. The Rio Grande Valley in Texas, and Texas corn in general, is being hugely impacted by this. All kinds of food crops, and not just obviously in the US, in Africa, in the Middle East, many places. So there's this, notion that when it comes to food, that two things. One, either we'll just move and grow them somewhere else. Instead of growing corn in Iowa, we'll grow corn in Minnesota. But that ignores all kinds of things like soil conditions and knowledge of the farmers doing this kind of work. And it's just not, you're not just going to like move food production, like get a bunch of U-Haul vans and move the entire corn production of Iowa up to Minnesota in a couple of weeks, right? That's not going to happen. And that same thing broadly true around the world. And the second thing is, there's this idea that we're just going to genetically adapt crops to hotter conditions, that we're just going to figure out the the gene that controls thermal regulation in crops, and we're going to have these genetically engineered, corn and tomatoes and wheat that will withstand whatever temperatures are on Earth. And that's, again, a profound misunderstanding of how heat works. This notion that heat is just a trait like blue eyes, that we can find the gene, pluck it out, and then all of a sudden everybody will have brown eyes, or that we find the gene for heat, pluck it out, and corn will grow in 130-degree temperatures, is just not how life works. And I talk to a lot of geneticists and stuff who talk about how heat is so integral to all the operations of a plant's life that you can't just simply genetically engineer plants for hotter climates. There certainly are, for example, corn, varieties of corn that do better in warmer places than others, but they have other limitations with water and light, and it's a very complex thing. So the food risk from these rising temperatures is very real.
And it, with rising temperatures, as you write about in the book, and we talk about a lot about on the show, like there's real vulnerability to diseases that we are not accustomed to facing. You write a lot about ticks and mosquitoes, which are super scary. Like, what is the scariest thing you feel like you've learned about ticks and mosquitoes researching this book?
Well, I mean, the scariest thing about ticks and mosquitoes is they're emblematic of how these changes in temperature are going to have a big impact on changes of disease and where diseases spread and how they spread and how quickly they spread. Ticks and mosquitoes are both very sensitive to temperatures and very mobile. And so, I spent a lot of time in Texas here in Houston with mosquito trappers out there who are trapping mosquitoes and looking for diseases. And, for example, mosquitoes carry there's many diseases that they carry, but among the three most notable and worrisome are dengue fever, Zika, and malaria. And, these are very serious diseases that sicken and kill a lot of people. I think malaria still kills about 400,000 people a year, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. But, it's almost impossible to kind of defend against these, invading, highly mobile mosquitoes that are moving into new places. So a great example of this is Mexico City, one of the biggest cities in the world. Has always been cool enough that mosquitoes can't really thrive there. And so nobody there has screens. Nobody there knows anything about Zika, dengue. There's just, mosquitoes are not an issue. And now, just because it's warmed up just a little bit, it's warm enough for the mosquitoes that carry dengue and Zika to begin to invade Mexico City. And so now the first cases of dengue and Zika are emerging in Mexico City, and there's just going to be more and more and more, and the place is completely unprepared for it. So we're going to see more of that. We're seeing a huge rise in cases in places like Nepal, similar conditions. Just a couple of weeks ago, we found the first evidence of the return of malaria to the United States. Climate change is driving the migration of animals into new places. And it's not just the mosquitoes and ticks, it's bats that are, that carry are reservoirs for all kinds of pathogens and viruses that are moving into new places. One scientist I talked to who researches this is concerned about what he calls meet cutes, like bats meeting up with other animals that they've never encountered before, exchanging pathogens with them, and all of a sudden a new pandemic emerges out of these random encounters with animals that have never kind of encountered each other before. So I think the disease risk from the changing migratory patterns of all kinds of animals is really serious and sort of underappreciated.
I thought it was really interesting in the book too that you note that the melting of permafrost and new diseases that could be unleashed, like this is the thing that keeps Bill Gates up at night that he worries the most about, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, kinds of wild stuff is emerging out of these thawing landscapes. And no one knows sort of what will emerge and what the consequences of it will be. We know we are destabilizing in a profound way the, sort of living world. And, things are emerging out of the ice, and things are scrambling to find hospitable places to live. I mean, you talked in the opening of this about the stories that are in the book. And, one of the stories that closes the book is my encounter with a polar bear on Baffin Island. And this polar bear it was a mother polar bear with two cubs, was hungry. And she was hungry because it was coming to the end of spring and she needed to fatten up. She had two cubs to feed, and the ice was melting more quickly than usual. And as the ice melts, which is their sort of hunting platform for seals, it becomes more and more difficult for them to get their food and to get fat enough to last through the summer. So she was desperate and hungry. And she found me and my friends sleeping, on the ice in a tent, like, 2-3 big hot dogs sort of laying there, and decided to sort of mosey over and see if she could have a snack.
I think I've done some cool stuff in my life and taken some risk. I am no Jeff Goodell. Oh my goodness. Reading this book, you take some incredible risks. I mean, you're in a ship going to Antarctica, as you mentioned, being in the Arctic around polar bears. And that is just, you've done some stuff that I would not do, Jeff. And it's like, how do you think about, I mean, it seems like this is part of your life and your passion. Like, how do you think about taking risk in your job and in your reporting?
Well, I mean, I think, journalism, I think that actually the risks I take, compared to the risks that many journalists take who are, covering the war in Ukraine on the front and things like that. I mean, I think journalism, the kind of journalism that, takes you out into the field and, requires a certain amount of risk taking. But I don't actually think, I mean, maybe I take more risks than your average climate journalist, but I think in the wide spectrum of journalism, I can think of, there's just a lot of journalists who are literally putting their life on the line every day to get, the stories and photos that we see. I mean, I'm just awestruck by some of these reporters in Ukraine, earlier in Iraq, in the Middle East, in all these conflict zones in Africa, who are like, risking their lives in an hourly way to bring us images and words to tell us what's going on. And I have just incredible respect for them. Compared to that, taking a ship to Antarctica and going through Drake Passage with 40-foot swells and things like that is, yeah, it's dangerous, but it's not really dangerous. I mean, that the chances, it's scary, but the chances of a ship, getting capsized, the kind of ship I was on, a research vessel in those kinds of swells, is really not great. Yes, the encounter with the polar bear on Baffin Island was dangerous, and I'm very lucky to have escaped alive from that. But I mean, we knew when we took that trip that there were a lot of polar bears. I didn't go there explicitly to study hungry polar bears, but we knew they were around, and it was just sort of a calculated risk that we would be okay. And obviously we were. I'm here talking to you about it. But it was definitely a risky trip, but it was also valuable. And, I had one of the most profound, well, not one of the most profound encounter with wildlife. And I've had a lot in my life because of that. And this is how you find stories and tell stories. And, I really think that climate journalists need to get out from behind the scientific papers and behind the desk and really get out into the world and think of themselves as war correspondents. And because that's kind of what we are.
Yeah, I imagine seeing these glaciers up front has it's impactful, right? In ways that just like studying it and writing about it can't be. And I know, you're well known in climate circles for nicknaming the Thwaites Glacier the Doomsday Glacier, which I think, and I'm not just blowing smoke, like I think that's a really important contribution to science communication and communicating climate risk. And like melting glaciers, which you write about, is one of the scariest things about a warming world. What do you fear the most when you've witnessed firsthand what scientists have told you about glacier melt and what we could face?
Well, I think it's what I saw in Antarctica at Thwaites is just the relative suddenness of it and the vulnerability of it. I mean, I've been to Greenland a number of times, and Greenland is very visually dramatic with the kind of collapsing front of the glaciers as they move into the sea, and you feel very clearly there that all of Greenland is like a popsicle on a hot sidewalk, that it's melting fast, and you see the moulins of water running down, and it just feels like a big piece of ice that's melting fast. Antarctica is very terrifying because it's very different. You don't see it in that sense, and that's one of the things that led scientists for years to think that Antarctica was fine. They would do satellite stuff on it and images, and they didn't see any surface melting whatsoever. Temperatures were still cold down there. There was a sense that Antarctica is this giant, huge, much larger than Greenland, continent of ice, but that it was stable. And then they started to understand that no, it's not so stable, because small changes in temperature in the Southern Ocean are allowing the water to get underneath these ice sheets and starting to melt them from below, which brings up this whole question of how quickly an ice sheet can collapse, because when they're being melted from below, it changes the sort of foundation of the ice sheet. And the thing that scientists are worried about is that a big glacier like Thwaites, aka the Doomsday Glacier, could kind of collapse relatively quickly, not like quickly in the sense of a week, but in the sense of a couple of decades, into the Southern Ocean, with huge consequences for every coastal city in the world. And so for me, I wrote about this and knew about it, and then I got invited on this trip, and coming face to face with that and trying to bend your mind around the scale of what's happening. And that's one of the hardest things about kind of coming to grips with what's happening with climate, whether you're a journalist or just a human being who's just trying to understand this, is the scale and scope of what's happening, and the immensity of it. And I really felt that when I was face to face with Thwaites and saw this enormous ice sheet that that looks like a thing that has always existed, and you can't imagine not existing. And yet we humans, by driving our SUVs and burning our coal and all that, are destabilizing and basically going to cause this enormous ice sheet to collapse. The only question is, what's the time scale that this is all going to happen on?
Yeah, I want to wrap up with this. As you mentioned, going back to the beginning of the conversation, this is a moment when this book, so many people are interested in learning about this topic and reading about this topic. And as you mentioned, it's in these kind of moments that offer an opportunity for really good science communication. And I have been just frankly, very excited, not only about the book and having read it and realize how compelling and interesting and grounded in the facts and reality are, but that just frankly, it's a New York Times bestseller and people are loving the book. And I think that presents an opportunity. I work in climate, and it is every day that you'll meet someone who was inspired by an inconvenient truth. And it changes people's lives. And again, it's a critical topic. It's such a compelling book. What is your hope that this might accomplish? Because again, you've been writing about this for decades. You've been recognized before. You've had books that have done really well. But it just feels like this is such a moment for such a critical book. I'm curious what you might hope, looking back 10 years from now, would be the legacy of a book like The Heat Will Kill You First.
Well, I mean, I am incredibly lucky and grateful that this moment the book is doing so well and that people are listening. And I think, to me, the most important thing is trying to communicate that we are at this sort of, inflection point, that our world is changing really fast, and that we have a real opportunity right now, if we pay attention, if we think about it, if we get educated about what's happening, to really change our world for the better. I mean, we really, we're going to change how we get our energy. That is going to happen. It is happening. We can accelerate that process. We can make choices about how exactly it plays out, but that's going to happen. How we get our food is going to change. It's just no question about it. If we get educated and smart about it, we can make it better. We can, there's a lot of things that we can do in this transition to make our food supply healthier, more equitable, all that kind of thing. And how we live, how we build cities. I mean, I think it's all up for grabs right now. And this moment, because of heat, because of people feeling this, because as one woman I was talking to the other day said to me, my daughter came up and said, "Mommy, why is the sky broken?" And there's this sense from everybody like something is happening, and what is happening. And I think these moments give us all who talk about this opportunities to really connect with people and really help them understand that this is not doomsday. It's a very serious and the scope and scale of what we face is enormous, but there's also tremendous opportunity at this moment. And I think that that's what I hope kind of comes out of this, is like, hey, we can use this moment to build a better, fairer, more just world, and let's get on with it.
That's a great place to end on. Again, the book is The Heat Will Kill You First: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. Jeff Goodell, been a fan of yours for years. It's so exciting to have you finally on the podcast. Thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for writing this amazing book.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's a great conversation.